Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining me tonight. Tonight I have Jennie Lee, and we're going to be talking about her new book. So, Jennie Lee is the award-winning author of True Yoga, Practicing with the Yoga Sutras for Happiness and Spiritual Fulfillment, and Breathing Love, Meditation in Action. She is a recognized expert in the fields of yoga therapy and spiritual living. As a certified yoga therapist, she has taught classical yoga and meditation for more than 20 years and coached private clients in the practices that integrate life spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and physically. Her writing is featured regularly in national magazines such as Light of Consciousness and Yoga Therapy Today, and online at Yogapedia, Yoga Digest, Mind, Body, Green, and many more. Her latest book, Spark Change, 108 Provocative Questions for Spiritual Evolution, is now available. She lives in Hawaii with her husband and bunnies. You can connect with Jennie on her website at jennieleeyogatherapy.com. So, Jennie, once again, thank you so much for agreeing to come here and chat with me tonight. I really appreciate it.
Hey, Drew. It's great to be here with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I think we're going to have a lot of fun tonight. So my first question is going to be this. So you've got 108 questions. I don't want to run through all 108 with you because I did promise you we were not going to be here for 3 hours, and I'm going to try and stick to that promise. But,
okay.
Why 108? I guess that's my first question. That's a very specific number.
Right, it is a specific number. It's a very significant number, and I give a pretty thorough explanation in the introduction to the book about that. But it's a significant number, particularly in yoga philosophy, also in science and other traditions. But there, if you are somebody who practices meditation, you might have used a mala to do mantras. There's always 108 beads on a mantra, on a mala. There are 108 Upanishads, which is one of the sacred texts in yoga. It is said that if you were to slow your breathing down in meditation so much so that you only took 108 breaths in a day, that you would reach enlightenment. So I thought that was an interesting and worthy goal. I definitely have not done that yet, but it's something to strive for. So yeah, but there's a whole lot of other significance to 108, and I go into it pretty thoroughly in the introduction. So yeah, that's a little teaser for that.
Oh, very, very cool. I'll be honest, I did not realize that 108 had such significance as a number. When a person is looking to grow themselves through introspection, what do you think are some of the key components to doing that, and how can yoga help? What are some pieces that are integral to that internal growth, and how does yoga help with them?
Sure. So, firstly, maybe I should just kind of qualify yoga for some people who might only understand yoga as like the physical exercise sort of practices that
Absolutely.
They have been exposed to classes. And yoga really is a lot more than that. And I write extensively about the bigger picture of yoga in my first book, True Yoga. Because this science, it's really a science of living, and it is a 5,000-year-old tradition. It encompasses a lot of lifestyle practices, a lot of medicine, as well as physical discipline and energy movement and meditation, and so there's whole lots of facets to what true yoga really is. But where it comes together with the book Spark Change, which I've just written, is in this quality of self-reflection or introspection. So what that has to do with yoga, and certainly anyone who is interested in growing personally, needs to take on the willingness to have a good long look at oneself. And that's not always the easiest thing to do for a couple different reasons. One is that we are very busy in our outer lives, and so we run around on a daily basis, basically focused on everything that's outside of us. And in doing that, often we will blame the things that are outside of us for what's not feeling very good inside of us. And so there's this sense of really coming home to an accountability of our own experience that is part of the self-reflection or introspective practice that yoga is talking about. So when I say yoga, what I really mean is the philosophies of yoga from ancient texts like the Yoga Sutras, the Bhagavad Gita, the Vedas, the Upanishads, and of these classical texts that are within yoga philosophy. So yes, we can go off in the yoga direction. We can talk more about what that practice looks like more tangibly and what these 108 questions have to do with it. Where would you like to go?
I mean, ¿por qué no los dos? Let's go everywhere. Before we go though, I liked you used the word accountability, and I like that a lot. I think that for myself, one of the things that I've always struggled with, and I don't think I'm alone in that, is being honest with myself and holding myself accountable for the right things. I think like most people, I, to a certain extent, will internalize things that I can't possibly be held responsible for, but somehow that's my fault. And the things that I probably should take a little more accountability for, like my outlook and the way I view things, I have a much harder time with. So I think that it's great that you use that word, because that is at least in my way of thinking, such a key to any sort of growth. So with that said, how do the 108 questions sort of spark this? How do they spark change?
Yeah, well, let me talk a little bit about accountability, because I'm with you, Drew, that I think this is something that is so important for every one of us. It's an interesting sort of two-sided coin, because, like you were saying, sometimes we almost make something our fault that isn't our fault. Mm-hmm. I was having a conversation with a client this morning who was feeling like something had been her responsibility. It had to do with someone else, but she had taken it on as her responsibility. And I was trying to explain, each one of us has to take accountability for our actions. That other person's action was his action. It's not your responsibility. So in that way, we've kind of got to pull back. I think people tend to be in one of two camps. Either they take on too much that might not be theirs, in maybe a desire to help or fix or whatever. And then there are, I think, a grand majority, and certainly we're seeing this in this country with the amount of acrimonious kind of finger pointing and blame throwing and mudslinging on all sides, not to go into politics, but on all sides, that is happening on the world stage right now. And so there's just this very fundamental human thing that happens when we are not happy with something. We quickly want to kind of push it away and make it somebody else's problem or fault or whatever. And we're not really going to grow personally, and we're certainly not going to grow collectively if we continue to do that. So in the book, Spark Change, which we're talking about tonight, there's a whole chapter on accountability, and the questions, I'm going to grab my copy. I'm just going to read you maybe a question out of that chapter to exemplify what, some of the ways that we might reflect upon accountability and how that would play into our self-growth process. So you mentioned, here's a good one. So you actually kind of alluded to this. This is question number 47. What am I not telling the complete truth about? And, that could be that you're not telling the complete truth about something to someone else, but it can also be that you're not telling the complete truth about something to yourself. And this is where we always have to start. We always have to start within. So if I'm, working for my own agenda, I might not be telling myself the complete truth about that. I might be making it seem like I'm working for somebody else as well, but really there's a selfish agenda underneath there. So it's when you get serious about personal development and particularly spiritual development, it does require that we look at the places in which we're not operating from highest consciousness. And we're all human. We all have selfish desires and needs and egoic tendencies, but we also have the capacity to rise above those and to act from values that are more based in compassion and cooperation and just unity-mindedness. So there's that. Would you like me to go with another question from the accountability chapter?
I mean, absolutely, yeah. It's interesting. You're asking these questions, and I'm going, how would I answer that? I'm not answering that in public. That's never. No, I'll keep that internally. I'll write that down. But yeah, please.
So here's the cool thing, Drew, is with this book, my hope, one of my hopes that people use this for a way to kind of understand themselves better. So change is hard. Any kind of change is hard. But when we understand ourselves better, change becomes easier. Mm-hmm. And we're in this time where we are just being forced into so many different kinds of changes. I mean, nobody's life, I don't think we could point to anybody's life that hasn't changed in the last 6 months in some way. Maybe some for better, but mostly many for worse. And people are struggling. And so we're being asked to kind of come into a greater awareness of how we've been operating. Again, individually and collectively, and where do we go from here? And so that inner clarity is really what takes us to good change. So as people work with these questions, you don't necessarily have to share them with anybody. You can just think about them. You can write about them in your journal if you're somebody who likes to write things down. I hope that people keep this book on their coffee table and just have conversations about it.
Sure.
Either with themselves or with people around them, but they don't, you don't have to be self-revealing if you don't want to. Again, so here's another question from the accountability chapter. This is one I really love. This is one I've been working on myself right now. How do I need to be more courageous? And this is certainly something that's been called out recently in the public sphere around racism. And how do we need to be more courageous in talking about it, in holding people accountable when we're feeling that behavior around us. These are uncomfortable times. They're uncomfortable places that we're all being asked to go, but the more that we step into courage, the courage of our own convictions and our highest values, and there's a whole chapter on values, and none of these chapters are me saying this is what needs to be. The questions are prompts to help people think about what's important to them, what matters to them, what really is the kind of governing value for their life, and how can they embody it, step into it, live from it, and be courageous in making positive differences for themselves and for the world.
Sure. So you mentioned values, which is interesting. When you think of values, or values in the context of your book, is it the values that I have are internal values? They're the things I value, that I see in that I value about myself, that I hold as things that I should be doing, as are my actions? Or are they external values where I go, I value when other people do this. I value when this thing happens, it makes me feel a certain way. Which direction does that go in?
Well, again, it's kind of both. Okay. Because we need to have our own center of reference, our own internal values. Mm-hmm. And then certainly knowing what we appreciate from the outside as well, also important. There's an interesting question. I'm going to pop that chapter open and read you one, which I think is kind of cool. It's, what do my possessions say about my prevailing values? And this is kind of an interesting one. This one stumps people sometimes because they're like, well, I don't know. I just kind of like that thing, that whatever it might be. But if we give a little time and analysis to our possessions and how they reflect certain values, it paints a picture that maybe we weren't even aware of who we are. And if the kind of commentary on each, there's a little commentary after each question. So the commentary on that question is like, well, if you assess this and you recognize that maybe your values are different than what your possessions have to say, then maybe it's time for a little house cleaning and realignment.
Yeah.
Because it can end up being a lot of clutter that really doesn't hold tremendous meaning.
Yeah, so as we were sort of talking about before we started here, I recently moved. Recently, I guess, all being relative. And there is something very interesting about going through all of your things and going, okay, I'm putting it in a box. Do I want it still? Is it something I'm going to use? Does it, there's almost a utilitarian sort of conversation you have with yourself. But I found, and I think, again, most people are somewhat similar, there were certainly things I brought because I was like, I will need this. I will need my dishes. I will need my pots and pans. I am going to need towels. These are important things. But towels are a good example, actually, because there are towels that I have that I don't use. They're beat up, they're old, the dog has chewed them, but in one case, it was the towel that when I first got my puppy, like I wrapped him in, it was like his blanket towel, and I was like, well, I can't get rid of this. This has value to me. So I think that's a really, really insightful question. And I don't know how I would even answer that. Is it fair to say that there is no right or wrong answer to any of these questions because it's all going to be subjective to the person, or are there some things that are somewhat universal?
I mean, after 20 years of working with people in a coaching capacity, I see so many similarities in people across a spectrum of socioeconomics, backgrounds, age, race. I mean, it doesn't really matter. You work with people long enough, you hear their intimate stories long enough, and there is so much commonality. And this is also something I talk about in the book, is like, how can we, I think one of the questions is, how can we replace judgment with love? And love being kind of an encompassing word that might also mean compassion or understanding, empathy, kindness, because fundamentally there are only so many human needs, human desires, fundamentally. And so to go back to your question, are there kind of universal answers to these? Maybe. They're going to be different for each person. There's no prescribed answers, and certainly I don't think anybody should walk through this book and just go, okay, yep, quick answer, here we go, check, check, check. And they're not, the questions aren't even necessarily meant to be totally answered as much as they are just pondered and sat with and felt and like, where does that leave me in my life? And what kind of new perspective might that open up? And how might that spark some interesting new positive change for me if I were to just consider something from a slightly different perspective? We can get really rigid in our views or our patterns of behavior, and I think it's important to just create some space around all of those and look with an open mind.
So it might be fair to say there aren't necessarily specific universal answers, but there are certainly universal themes to the answers. And themes is a good word here because you sort of have alluded to it already. There's an accountability section, there is a values section, there are 12 major themes throughout the book. What are those themes? What are the other ones?
Yeah. So the themes, there's 12 themes, and each one has 9 questions. And so these 12 themes are, they follow what I have defined in working with clients over the years who have been in all phases of different transitions in their life. So some have been recovering from health issues, some, or going through a health crisis. Maybe I've worked with clients right to the time of death. Some have been in transition in relationships. Some have been making career changes. So any kind of change that we encounter has kind of an arc, and it's similar in a way like you think about grief. And when we go through a loss, there are common kind of touch points in the grieving process that everyone goes through, whether that's shock, anger, sorrow, disbelief. And so in the same way with changes, any kind of changes, I have found there's kind of this arc that of thematic sort of stages that we go through. And so that's what the book follows. And I can read those 12 to you.
Yeah, please.
Should have them memorized by now. But anyway, the first chapter is just called Changes. But what that alludes to is just the identification of what it is that may be up for change or needing change. Second one is Values. We talked about kind of clarifying what that most important direction is. Beliefs is the third, because of course all of our experience depends on our beliefs, and so if those are askew, then our experience of life is going to be misaligned with where we want it to be. Willingness, because any kind of change or transition really does require a willingness to do some internal and external work. Mm-hmm. Lessons. Lessons are what we learn along the way. I mean, for me, life is one big learning experience. This is a big school, so the more we can take it on with that intent, the better off we're going to be. Accountability, we've talked about. Next one is acceptance, because as we well know, things are what they are right now, and yeah, so we just have to kind of work from what is. Inspiration, then we get a little more esoteric. So inspiration, how do we find and maintain really great levels of inspiration? Knowing, because humans love to know, but we can't always know what lies ahead. So how do we sit with that? Love, purpose, and mastery are the last three chapters. And those are the final kind of stages of stepping into what I believe is positive change, is when we come into alignment with, love being one of the greatest values, in my opinion. Purpose, we all want to feel that. We all want to feel some sense of meaning in who we are and what we're doing here. And mastery, of course, is the ability to stay in that high vibrational consciousness of living from all that.
Yeah. So let me. I've got a couple questions then. So first, are lessons always positive? And what I mean by that is, can the lesson you learn be something that is negative but still necessary for growth? And if it does make you grow, is it even negative at that point? Yeah,
that's a great question, Drew. It's because it's a kind of a question within a question. But ultimately, yes, I think anything that helps us grow is a positive, even if it's hard, even if it hurts, even if it feels negative, or is a temporary kind of setback. Sometimes temporary setbacks in life, in anything, any aspect of life, are some of our greatest lessons, and we just have to keep going. We're learning resilience, we're learning will, we're learning trust of divine timing, maybe, or there's many different things that we might be learning through that, through setback or failure, but I think ultimately they're all positive.
Okay. What would you consider knowing to be? You talked about mastery, and you talked, obviously, love is simultaneously the most self-explanatory and probably the one that needs the most explanation. But knowing, you hooked me with that line that people love to know. Absolutely, I'm guilty of that. I want to know the reasons behind everything. So what does knowing mean in this context?
Yeah, so I believe that we have varying levels of intelligence. There's the intellectual intelligence that is very much the analytical mind, scientific mind, which is so important, and that's one type of knowing. But equal to that, and in my opinion equally as important, is the intuitive mind, which knows things that are not necessarily provable on an external or physical basis in the moment. And I've had lots of experiences personally of having an intuitive sense about something and getting proof of it later. So I've learned to trust that sense of knowing. that's quite different from the intellect. Now, I believe to be a fully functional human, we need both of those levels of knowing on board and coordinating with one another. Mm-hmm. Then we've kind of got all switches on.
Yeah. So let's talk about love, because I think that it is one of those things that every single human being universally feels a desire to be loved, feels a desire to love, and yet, again, I'm going to speak from my experience and then generalize to everyone, because I happen to think I'm not that dissimilar from most people. Self-love isn't the way I want to put this, but self-love is something that's difficult. You know, when I've loved a person, I don't just love the things about them that are wonderful and perfect. There are also things that are, negative or quirky, and I love those too. And why is it so difficult for us to do that for ourselves, and so easy for us to do that with other people? What do you think? What makes that so easy, and what makes it so difficult at the same time?
I would love to hear you answer that question, Drew. Why do you think it's harder to be kind and non-judgmental with your own faults or quirks than it is with someone else's?
And this is the part of the show where we dig into my psyche. All right. I think honestly that it has to do with the fact that, one, we spend more time with ourselves than we do with anybody else. And two, as a result of that, I can think of a number of times that I go, gosh, I know I should have done X in a certain way. I should have really given more effort to this, and I know I could have, and I don't have a good reason why I didn't. But I was tired and I was burned out, and we're much, I think, more forgiving and able to let other people off the hook because we give them the benefit of the doubt when something goes wrong, and it's harder for us to do that for ourselves because I'm with me all the time. I know when I phoned it in a little bit, or I could have and should have done this better, or I could have been kinder, or I thought something that was uncharitable, and then I feel kind of guilty about that. I think that's probably a big piece of it.
Well, I think that's great, Drew, that you have a conscience that can self-reflect and see those places where maybe you could have been a little bit, like you said, more charitable, kinder, whatever. So you're recognizing that in yourself. And this is the journey that I'm offering people a guided exploration through in Spark Change. It's just a way of kind of looking within and going, yeah, I could have done something a little different there. Or I could have been more aligned with my core values there. And I make it really clear in the beginning of the book that this is to be undertaken with the greatest kindness and the greatest self-compassion. Never is introspection to be taken on with a harsh, critical, judgmental inner voice. Many people have that harsh inner voice because they experienced it outwardly.
I was going to say, that was my internal voice. It's all, kind of nagging there in the background. You should have done that better. And I'm like, I know.
Yeah. But, we internalize those voices because we've heard them outwardly. It might have been a teacher or a parent or someone in your community growing up. There's many ways in which we get these harsh voices in our heads, but then, of course, we perpetuate them. Mm-hmm. So, going back to let's talk about love, and your question about why it's harder to do this, to love self, really, versus loving someone else. Well, it's because we have forgotten our highest self-concept. And what I mean by that is we don't really know who we are. So we think that we are these personalities. You're Drew, I'm Jenny. We come from these different parts of the United States, and we've had this, these similar experiences or different experiences. And we think of this as who we are. But when we're talking from a spiritual perspective, we're really a lot more than those human stories. And so when we're talking about self-love, it's not just about loving that personality that has gone through this little life history and made certain mistakes and done certain good things, But it's about remembering that there's a soul inside of us. There's a soul that is eternal, and it's beautiful, and it's whole, and it's perfect, and it's love and beauty. And we've just forgotten about that inner spirit in many ways. And we've shrunk ourselves into this tiny little self-concept of personality. And then when we really take on this journey of remembering our greater self, our spiritual self, then we start to re-embody some of these soul qualities that, like kindness, like compassion, like love, and they don't seem so foreign anymore because we've actually called part of our spirit back. We've called our spirit back into our human experience.
So let me ask you then, how much of the growth that we're trying to achieve, you're trying to help someone achieve with Spark Change, how much of that is of a spiritual component, and is it possible to do this growth without tapping into that part of yourself?
Well, you can do part of it. I would say there are levels to personal growth. And I come from a background in psychology and then did studies in what was in a phase of psychology called spiritual psychology. And then with the yoga philosophy studies, I brought these two things together into my coaching practice. And the subtitle of the book, it's Spark Change, and then 108 provocative questions for spiritual evolution. So ultimately, I think someone can take on a practice of looking inward and doing personal growth and kind of getting better within themselves and aligning their life on just a human level. But ultimately, at least in my belief structure, there is a spiritual part to all of us, and the ultimate joy is when we reunite that spiritual part with the human part and we feel aligned in both. And that's where these big leaps in purpose come forward, and we're suddenly living lives of much greater meaning, much greater joy, much greater peace. So it really takes, it's multi-dimensional.
Sure. And I would imagine that, it's difficult in a good way, in a cathartic way, to answer or to try and answer these questions. Is the process, is it okay to work on part of it and then go, sort of like working out, you go, okay, I've lifted a lot today, I'm gonna take a break from it, I'm gonna come back to this when I feel more ready and I've internalized kind of the answers I've given for myself? Or is it the kind of thing where you go and, maybe you never complete it. Maybe the journey is always ongoing.
Well, both. I mean, Drew, you've been asking some great questions where it's like, yes, all of the above. Because this is not a book that most people are going to read cover to cover. It's a book that they're going to dip into, grab a question, have a conversation about it with themselves or somebody else, think about it for a while, set it down, and then maybe go back to it the next day or week or month or whatever. And even if you were to go through every question now, and then you were to look at it 2 years from now, your answers would be different. So it is absolutely kind of an ongoing process. There's no right way to utilize these questions. They're just there to play with, have fun with, think about. Just give yourself some new kind of inspiration to. I can't take credit for the title, but God bless my editor and team at TBC Drew for coming up with this term Spark Change, because they really are that. Like, my working title was the 108 questions, but they really do spark change on so many levels of our life, whether it's just the simple day-to-day kind of what we're choosing to do with our time, or big, more monumental questions about what the purpose of life is in general, so, yeah.
So let's shift gears for a second then and talk about the process of this book. Obviously, writing or in this case, publishing a book during a pandemic has got to be Very, very, very difficult. But this also isn't your first book, so you've kind of experienced both worlds. What are some of the differences this time around?
Well, books don't just pop out. This one has been about 2.5 years in the making. So between the concept, the book proposal, getting the contract, writing the book, production, etc., and then we were slated for release in April, which then got pushed to September, not because of the pandemic. That change happened, I think, back in January or even before. And at the time, I was disappointed. But then April came, and we're in the middle of a pandemic, and it's pushed off to September. And now I think it's actually the absolute perfect time for this book to be coming into people's hands. Hopefully for inspiration while they're thinking about all the different changes that are going on in their lives. But for me, it's always a process of kind of trusting the whole unfoldment of it, because no book is made in a vacuum. When you're publishing traditionally, I've published, which sounds true. So it's a team effort. There's a lot of steps to the process, and for the author, it's agonizing almost to wait as long as it takes from concept to getting it into people's hands. So like right now, being on launch week, it's just so nice to have people actually holding the book and telling me their thoughts and giving me some feedback. But it's also really fun to be able to connect with people in all parts of the country over Zoom and, this way of the world right now that we're in. It's not something that I would have been able to do had we not had this circumstance on our plates, because I couldn't have traveled all over the country and met people in different communities.
Of course, and therein lies a lesson, probably trying to find, and I feel like trying to find implies like I'm looking through bad things to find something good. Finding something positive and something that is so negative in many ways. Getting to talk with you and getting to do this event, I don't know that we would have done this. We would have occurred to us to do this, in a pre-pandemic world. So absolutely, that's cool. One of the things that I've listened to people talk about when it comes to writing and it comes to books is the idea of an ideal reader, or the dream reader, the person who you, quote unquote, wrote this book for. Who is the ideal reader for this book?
I have several, actually.
Okay.
There are some folks who are not readers at all. I have some really dear friends who have said to me, I'm really not a reader. Mm-hmm. And I actually think this book is going to be one of their favorites, because it's not a book, like I said, that you have to pick up and read cover to cover. Each page has a question, and then that question has a little commentary. So it's very short, way to dip into some interesting, thought-provoking content. Without a big time investment. And I think everybody is time crunched right now, and they're energy crunched too. Everybody's kind of exhausted. And so you don't have to make this a big reading adventure. That being said, there are also those people who are very serious about their personal and spiritual growth, who are going to devour a book like this from cover to cover. They're going to take out a brand new, beautiful journal, like some people have already posted to me on their social media. They bought a special journal and can't wait to get into every single question. And this is what I'm going to do over the next year. And it's laid out for 12 themes. And so just perfect timing to really clarify what I want my next steps to be. And this is going to be a great guide. So I think either one of those people would be my ideal reader, and I hope that it can kind of meet people where they are. And that's something I really try to do on my coaching practice is, I have a big toolbox from 2 decades of coaching in yoga therapy and spiritual psychology, but not every tool is right for everybody. So it's about looking at where you are right now and what you need, and just use that and forget the rest. I don't care. Like, if one question touches your life in a positive way, then I'll be super happy about that.
Very cool. Well, you already answered my next question, which is, what would be the ideal thing someone could tell you about your book? So let me ask this instead. You alluded to the fact that this was a multi-year process, which makes complete sense. What's, if you'll pardon my pun, what sparked this journey? What sparked the idea where you went, I'm going to write this book?
It's funny. There wasn't a particular thought. What happens for me when I'm working on an idea for a book is that I just sort of start having random ideas on a particular theme. So I was thinking about the process of change that I have walked through with so many clients, and really thinking about how I might quantify that for somebody who either doesn't want to work with a coach, doesn't have the finances to work with a coach, etc. And really wanting to offer some of what my clients have told me is valuable in the work that we've done, but offer that to my readers. And so I started making notes on that topic, and at a certain point, those notes just somehow magically congeal. And in the introduction to Spark Change, I talk about there just comes a moment when you know that there is something happening. You know there's something more for you, that you know that there is a change that you can no longer avoid making. It might come as a discomfort, or it might come as a big light bulb on. For me, it's usually when I'm awake at 2 a.m. And I wrote the introduction to this book at 2 a.m. And now I'm not a night owl. I go to bed at like 8:30 and I sleep through the night. I have a solid sleep schedule and not a night owl. So if something is burning a hole in my head at 2:30 in the morning, then I know it's important, and I trust that, and I get up and I write.
Okay. Well, I am impressed by anyone who goes to bed early. I am the exact opposite. I picked up terrible habits in college, and now that's just kind of how I live. So this is a book that's about conversations with the self, but it also can be conversations with other people. Would you envision this being, well, I guess twofold. One, is there a right way to read it? Should it be read with a person that you care? Is it a collaborative effort, or should it really be internal? I guess is the first part of that.
Well, I think it's, again, both, all the above, Drew. This book is actually almost like a book club in and of itself. We actually have a book club guide that people can get for free on my website. You announced it, and I'm sure it's in the show notes, but Jennie Lee, yogatherapy.com is my website, and there's a free book club guide. Because I really feel like this book will also make great material for book clubs. People who are interested in this kind of self-development material and spiritual development material to get together and talk about these things, they're going to inspire one another. And so I think it absolutely is twofold. It's meant to be self-reflective internally, but then it also can be great conversationally. And I've already heard about a couple women's groups that are using it, and so yeah, it was just going to be fun to see how people roll with it.
Very cool. Well, Jennie, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me tonight. I want to end on what I hope is simultaneously the most fun and maybe the toughest question. So no pressure, I promise. But
you're gonna put me on the spot for the most fun question?
It is a little. It's a small spot, I promise. No, not a big spotlight.
Okay.
The world, the world, as we've sort of talked about, is tough right now. No matter how you want to slice it, no matter what side of any issue you're on, it is not a comfortable place to be. But at the same time, being in an uncomfortable place can in many cases force change. Of the questions that you've got, what's one that you'd like to leave us with to sort of ponder over that can maybe help us come to something a little peaceful and a little more patient with everything that's going on today?
Well, this is my go-to question. It's something that I work with almost daily, and it's a sort of a question and a question. It is, what do I need? What is the question that I need to answer right now? Because I believe that the formulation of the right question is so important before we can possibly even come near an answer. And we rush often to get to answers without really taking the time to ask, well, what is it that I really should be asking right now? So that's a clarifying question that's pretty open-ended. It's something anyone can take and sit with. And I truly believe in the power of questions like that to take people to their right answers at the right time.
That's a pretty great question. I like that. I like that the question is, what is the question? There's something very thoughtful there. Well, again, Jenny, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us tonight. I really enjoyed it. I hope that you had a nice time too. And if you'll allow me for a moment, I'm going to shamelessly plug. You can get Jenny's book at Town Book Center. You can come see us in person. We are letting people into the store. We just require that you wear a mask. But you can come see us in Collegeville, Pennsylvania. Or you can always shop with us online at townbc.com. That's TOWN as in Nike, E as in Echo, B as in Bravo, C as in Charlie.com. So again, thank you everyone for tuning in, and thank you, Jenny, for taking some time with me tonight.
Thank you, Drew. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, and best of luck to you and your community there in Pennsylvania.
Thanks so much. Have a great night.
You too.